Okay, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack the fascinating cognitive science behind why our default study habits are, well, they're actually betraying our brains. Think about your typical study routine, right? Especially before a massive exam. We've all been there. The late nights, the endless highlighting, those coffee-fueled cram sessions where you're trying to forcefully pack an entire semester of complex concepts into your head in just 48 hours. We desperately want to learn efficiently, but hardcore neuroscientific research shows that the most popular ways we study are fundamentally at odds with how human memory biologically functions. So today, we're going to break down the neuroscience of durable learning and show you exactly how to rewire your routine for permanent retention. To really understand the stakes of this science, let's start with a real-world scenario. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a novice nurse on their very first clinical rotation. The environment is chaotic. Suddenly, an IV pump starts alarming loudly, and a patient is clearly in distress. Now, this student is incredibly dedicated. They literally spent 8 uninterrupted hours the night before cramming the textbook chapter on IV protocols. They highlighted every single line. But right now, in this high-pressure moment, they completely freeze. Why? Why didn't those 8 hours of intense, focused cramming actually translate into clinical performance when it mattered most? Well, this phenomenon shatters a universal myth that cognitive scientists call the illusion of knowing. When we reread our notes or cram information in one massive block, our brain naturally processes that text a little bit faster each time. And that rapid processing speed creates this profound feeling of fluency. You look at the page and think, yep, I recognize this, I know it. But here's the catch. Fluency is absolutely not the same thing as mastery. Fluency just means the information is sitting in your short-term working memory, and it's heavily dependent on the visual cues right in front of you. As the researchers bluntly state, for actual durable long-term learning, these strategies are pretty much a waste of time. So, contrast massed practice, which is what we commonly call cramming, with active retrieval practice. Cramming gives you this warm, false safety net. It feels super productive because it's mentally easy, You're just passively absorbing information. Active retrieval practice, on the other hand, means putting the book completely away and forcing your brain to reconstruct the information from scratch. And honestly, this is the cold, hard biological reality of learning. It feels difficult. It feels incredibly clunky, and you are going to make a lot of mistakes. But that specific struggle, the literal mental sweat of trying to pull the answer out of the void, is exactly what signals to your brain that this information is vital and needs to be permanently stored. And the hardcore data overwhelmingly backs this up. Landmark research in cognitive science, like the famous Roediger and Karpik studies, demonstrates that long-term retention, measured weeks or even months later, is literally 2 to 3 times greater using active recall rather than passively rereading highlighted textbooks. In their experiments, students who tested themselves retained roughly 61% of the material a week later. Compare that to a dismal 24% for the ones who just reread. Just imagine getting double or triple the return on your study time simply by closing the book, experiencing a little friction, and testing yourself. It's huge. Let's move to Section 1, Spacing and Memory Consolidation, Building Neural Pathways. Let's look at how this actually works under the hood. While the brain isn't exactly a muscle, the neural pathways that make up our learning strengthen in a very similar biological way.
Think about the gym metaphor for a second. You wouldn't lift heavy weights for 9 hours straight and expect to instantly walk out with massive muscles, right? You have to stress the tissue, rest, and let it biologically rebuild. Memory formation happens in 3 distinct, time-dependent steps. Step 1 is lay-by learning. When you first encounter new info, the memory trace in your brain is incredibly fragile. It's easily overwritten. Step 2 requires time, often hours, and crucially, it requires sleep. During this mental rehearsal phase, structures like your hippocampus actively replay the learning to the neocortex, giving it meaning and filling in blank spots. Finally, step 3 is consolidation, where the brain literally physically reorganizes, thickening synaptic connections to your long-term memory. You simply cannot biologically rush this structural process with an all-night cram session. It doesn't work.
So the crucial point here is that you actually need a little bit of forgetting to happen. This is the biological magic of spaced practice, which is heavily rooted in the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. When you allow some time to pass between study sessions, the memory trace naturally begins to fade. So when you finally force yourself to retrieve it a day or two later, it is significantly harder. But that exact friction is the biological trigger. It tells your brain, hey, we're struggling to recall this, but we keep needing it, so we must thicken this neural pathway. Slight forgetting and the struggle to overcome it is actually your absolute greatest ally in building durable memory. Which brings us to Section 2, Interleaving, training the brain to discriminate. If spaced practice is about when you study, interleaving is all about how you organize the exact material you're studying. Think about blocked practice. This is what most of us naturally do. You study all the hard issues, you master them for the day, and then you move on to all the lung issues tomorrow. Interleaved practice, conversely, mixes them all up randomly in a single session. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you. Teachers and students alike almost universally hate interleaving. Why? Because it feels incredibly sluggish and deeply confusing. You feel like you're constantly starting over, and you never get to feel fully on top of the material before you're forced to switch gears. Yet, the empirical data proves unequivocally that interleaved study vastly outperforms block study for long-term mastery and actual problem solving. And this is exactly why interleaving is so crucial in high-stakes environments like healthcare. When a patient comes into the ER with shortness of breath, they don't have a convenient little label on their forehead telling you what chapter of the textbook their illness comes from. Interleaving forces you to practice diagnosing the difference. It trains the brain to actively compare, discriminate, and choose the correct concept from your memory banks, rather than just reciting isolated facts in a comfortable vacuum. This brings us to a really foundational concept coined by cognitive psychologist Robert Bjork back in 1994, desirable difficulties. Think of this as the ultimate paradigm shift for your entire educational life. If your studying feels easy, fluent, and comfortable, you are doing it wrong. You want to introduce strategic friction. For example, using flashcards, but genuinely forcing your brain to sweat and struggle for the answer for 10 solid seconds before you let yourself flip the card over. You are intentionally slowing down your initial learning. I know it feels frustrating in the moment, but it radically enhances your ability to transfer that knowledge to real-world, dynamic situations later on. Now let's look at Section 3, Transfer Appropriate Processing, or TAP, in the clinical setting, because we aren't just memorizing flashcards for a trivia night here. We are preparing to make decisions that actually impact human lives. TAP is a cognitive model contending that to have memory successfully recalled later, the way you initially encode the information has to match the specific environment where you'll eventually need to retrieve it. Reading a textbook alone in a quiet, perfectly climate-controlled library, that simply does not match the chaotic, noisy, and highly stressful environment of a crashing patient in an emergency room. The cognitive processes you use in the library are entirely different from the ones you're going to need in the trauma bay. Passive classroom lectures offer a low-stress encoding environment, right? Whereas active clinical simulations offer high-stress encoding. Research strongly shows that practicing retrieval under simulated pressure actually mimics the final clinical environment. It physically locks those clinical judgment skills in, ensuring that when the real alarms start going off, your brain knows exactly how to retrieve the right information. Why? Because it has already practiced doing it under nearly identical neurological conditions. And this explains exactly why that highly dedicated novice nurse from our first scenario completely failed under pressure. Studies on cognitive load theory show that when complex clinical environments cause immense stress, novices lack those automatic experiential patterns. Because their decision-making is still deliberate and agonizingly slow, the physiological stress causes tunnel vision, and their working memory basically becomes completely bottlenecked. As a result, they start unintentionally taking dangerous shortcuts, like skipping critical safety checks on IV pumps, which exponentially increases the risk of patient harm. We aren't just trying to pass a multiple-choice exam. We are trying to build automatic, life-saving recall that survives the amygdala hijack of a high-stress scenario. Which brings us to our final point, Section 4, the lifelong impact of spaced repetition. Does adopting these harder, friction-filled study habits actually pay off over the span of a whole career? Well, tracing the career of a medical professional, a 2019 systematic review by Phillips and colleagues looked at the effects of spaced repetition on practicing healthcare workers. And what they found is amazing. Spaced repetition doesn't just help you pass your initial board certifications, it permanently alters and enhances a clinician's actual on-the-job behaviors well into year 15 of their practice. By continuously engaging in retrieval practice over years, professionals build an incredibly robust, deeply consolidated database of medical expertise that resists decay. They don't have to look up the basics anymore, which leaves their cognitive bandwidth entirely free to handle complex, novel emergencies. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought. If frustration, effort, and cognitive friction are the actual biological triggers for true mastery, how are you going to change your study habits today? It is absolutely time to ditch the pastel highlighters, step away from the comforting but highly dangerous illusion of rereading, and lean heavily into those desirable difficulties. Because the harder and clunkier your brain has to work today, the more automatic and reliable it will be when it truly matters tomorrow. Thanks for joining me on this explainer and happy studying.